Hi, thank you for coming to QHU. My name is Alyssa Jordan. I am the Interim Development Director at Quigley House, and I am joined by Angelica Karamis, who is our CPI co-located advocate, but she has a different title as well, which she can tell you. It's got a lot of letters in it, so, but she kind of is our kind of go-between between like DCF, KFF, and our survivors. So she's our child welfare advocate is a simple way to put it. Today we're going to be talking about Women's History Month and the Herstory Movement. So in case you didn't know, March is Women's History Month. So usually it originally started in 1981 with just a week, with the week of March 7th being declared Women's History Week, and then March 8th is International Women's Day. But since 1995, March has been recognized as Women's History Month, and this month is to celebrate the contributions women have made to the United States and recognize special achievements women have made in the course of history. And all throughout March, we have been posting women-centered things on Monday. Obviously, we are typically a women-centered agency, but we do serve men as well. But March, we just like to celebrate the women who have made an impact in our movement and just in history in general. So Rosa Parks, we highlighted Rosa during Black History Month, which was last month, but she's still a very important woman as well. So this is just a powerful quote from her. You must never be fearful about what you are doing when it is right. And then we also have another quote by Maya Angelou: the more you know of your history, the more liberated you are. So the goal of this QHU is just for us to continue learning and growing, not only as women, but just as people. And I'm going to pass over to Angelica, and she's going to talk about the Herstory Movement.
So the Herstory Movement, you may have heard about this term before, but we're going to briefly elaborate on what the Herstory Movement is and how it relates to our movement in domestic violence and violence against women. So the Herstory Movement refers to history being written or given from the feminist perspective, and therefore emphasizing the role that women have played throughout the course of history. So within the domestic violence movement, the Herstory refers to the pain and struggles, the work, advocacy, stories, and voices of the survivors, workers, and victims that have come together and contributed to the movement towards ending violence against women. And we talk about the violence against women movement because primarily survivors are female, though we do acknowledge that males and members of the LGBTQ community are also as victimized as well. For the purposes of this presentation, we're just going to focus on the violence against women movement. Now, the Herstory of domestic violence can really date back to 753 BC and probably even before that. But for the purposes of this presentation, that's where our timeline starts. And that was during Romulus's reign in Rome. So under his reign, the men in the community could chastise and beat their women, and it was accepted and condoned. And it had allowed the husbands to have absolute right of their wives and to discipline their wives however they saw fit. So the law permitted husbands to beat their wife with a rod or switch so long as its circumference was no greater than the man's right thumb. So that's where that term rule of thumb originated. So when we think about these terms and these kind of things we have in our culture, it kind of sometimes has a dark history to it. So throughout history, these laws are perpetuated and continued in English common law and throughout most of Europe. And it wasn't until 1829 that in England, a husband's absolute power of chastisement is abolished. So we're starting at 753 BC and going all the way up until the early 1800s. And in the late 1800s, the court started to begin to show signs that they may hold husbands responsible, and they were starting to find them guilty of marital rape. So again, a pretty big deal coming from such a long time of no laws that respected women or gave women rights over their autonomy or their bodies or their even behavior. So in the US, it was kind of the same situation. There were very few laws to protect victims of domestic violence, a majority of whom are women and children. So in the 1950s, we see the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the Black liberation movements, which essentially laid down the groundwork for the second feminist movement. So the first movement being the right to vote and the suffragette movement. So the second feminist movement refers to the conversations about child abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault that had been happening for so long. So throughout this time, domestic violence victims and survivors still had no protections in the United States. So for example, if a domestic violence case came up in New York, it would be transferred to family court and it was handled as a civil law matter, meaning that the husbands would not be held um, guilty in a court of criminal law if they assaulted their wives. So if the survivor wanted to divorce their abuser, they had to show that a significant or sufficient number of beatings had taken place to prove that before the divorce is granted. So in the 1970s, the phrase "we will not be beaten" becomes the mantra of women across the country organizing to end domestic violence. And so this grassroots movement effort begins. And so we start to transform the public consciousness and talk about it in public, and the topic becomes less and less taboo. So the common belief that within the movement is that women face brutality from their husbands, and there's this indifference from social institution. So in Philadelphia, one of the first feminist self-help groups, Women in Transition, forms, and they provided services for divorced or separated women, battered wives, and single mothers. Then the first women's shelters opened, that being the Bay Area Women Against Rape in California, and then the Rainbow Retreat in Phoenix, Arizona. So they start to form to provide support for rape victims and combat the criminal treatment in the legal system. So in 1978, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence is founded. And at the same time, interestingly enough, Florida starts to charge an additional $5 on marriage licenses to start funding the DV centers that they plan to open. So as late as 1979, less than 15 state legislatures have enacted laws providing funding for shelter. And then less than half of those shelters receive any state or federal funding. In 1981, the NCADV declares October 17th as a National Day of Unity on behalf of battered women across the country. The first annual Domestic Violence Awareness Week is celebrated, and there are about 500 domestic violence shelters in the United States at that time. The following year, the NCADV features the first Women of Color conference, where race, class, and homophobia are discussed as the main topics of the conference. At the same time, intersectionality starts to become a topic of conversation as well. By 1983, there's about 700 shelters in operation around the nation, serving 91,000 women and 131,000 children per year. So in the 1990s, we see a lot more awareness and support for domestic violence victims and survivors. By then, 48 states had enacted or revamped injunctions that enable courts to refrain men from abusing, harassing, and assaulting women with whom they live. Emergency protection orders outside of normal court hours can be obtained in 23 states, so filing for that emergency injunction is now possible. And then as well, in 23 states, police officers may arrest on probable cause in cases of simple or minor assault within the home, which means that the batterers are not staying in the home with these survivors if the police don't choose to arrest them. So a few cities and states go even further by imposing a mandatory duty to arrest the violent offender, of which Florida is one of them. In 1993, the United Nations recognizes domestic violence as a international human rights issue and issues a declaration on the elimination of violence against women. And then finally, in 1994, Congress passes the Violence Against Women Act, which is part of the Federal Crime Victims Act, which funds services for victims of rape and domestic violence and allows women to seek civil rights remedies for gender-related crimes and provides training to increase police and court official sensitivity. It's the first time that a federal right to sue the assailant for gender-based violence and provides the states and American Indian nations full faith and credit to each other's restraining orders. It was a very groundbreaking decision and a policy that was made, and it's made us possible to have services. It gives us the funding to have services to help these survivors as they come into our shelters or receive our outreach services. So then by 1996, there's over 1,200 shelters in the United States, sponsored by approximately 1,800 domestic violence agencies. And the NEDV identified 1,949 domestic violence programs in 2007. So today, advocates are really working towards holding batterers accountable in the court of law, making sure that they're the ones that are reaping the repercussions of their actions and not the survivor. And making sure that survivors are not re-victimized by the systems that they encounter, may that be law enforcement or child welfare or educational systems, housing. And we're making sure that the programs that we are using to provide services to our survivors are empowerment-based, trauma-informed, and survivor-centered. After the declaration of VAWA, agencies and shelters around the nation started receiving those necessary fundings to assess the needs of their community and to fight for legislative action on behalf of survivors. So the subject of domestic violence has become more commonplace and publicly known through the hard work of survivors and advocates around the world. So movements like Me Too, Veto Violence, and One Thing have created not only conversations virtually, but in pop culture and commonplace and the everyday lives of the public. So the future Herstory of domestic violence, of the domestic violence movement seeks to continue supporting survivors of domestic violence, educating the community about the subject, and providing resources for those seeking assistance. And it's only possible through the public's informed support. So I like to add this quote: girls compete with each other, but women empower one another. We have some famous women of the Herstory movement that we wanted to highlight because it's also Women's History Month. So Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, she was an attorney and professor at UCLA, and she coined the term and concept of intersectionality, which is a bedrock and a cornerstone in feminist theory. So she played a critical role in supporting Anita Hill during Justice Thomas's Senate confirmation hearings. So Anita Hill was a survivor who, during Justice Thomas's Senate confirmations, disclosed that he had tried to sexually assault and sexually harass her. So Kimberly Crenshaw basically supported her and helped guide her through that trial. So intersectionality provides a framework for understanding the unique ways in which multiple forms of oppression affect women of color. And she continues to speak out in support of sexual violence survivors, civil rights, and police violence against women. Her podcast, Intersectionality Matters, explores the concept of its practical application to discrimination today. We also have Erin Pizzey. In 1971, Erin founded the first and currently the largest domestic violence shelter in the modern world, which was known as the Chiswick Women's Aid, and it's now known as the Refuge. She also authored Scream Quietly or the Neighbors Will Hear, one of the first books that documented the experiences of battered women. We also have Betsy Warrior. In 1976, Betsy published the first international directory for organizations and individuals and supporting and advocating for women experiencing domestic violence, and that was called Working on Wife Abuse. The publication provided a list of refuges and shelters for women and also spread awareness of the issue and opened up the conversation about domestic violence. She received the first Jane Doe Unsung Hero in 1993 and was one of the key people who contributed to funding the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the nation's leading grassroots movement on domestic violence. And I'm going to hand it back over to Alyssa, and she's going to discuss some of our events at Quigley House this month and next month.
And before I talk about our events coming up, I definitely want to thank Angelica for going through the Herstory movement and covering all of that information, because there is a ton. And we as advocates and as domestic violence shelters and sexual assault centers, we are still working on, you know, educating people and making sure that we can end violence for everybody, including women. And it's so critical to support, you know, your local domestic violence shelter, your local sexual assault center, even if you're not in Clay County, even if that's not us. Like, those places need your support because those people need your support. They're enduring all of this trauma and all of these things, and they feel utterly alone. And so it's important for us as advocates and just people to love one another and support one another and believe one another. I think that's the biggest thing that we take from the Me Too movement or veto violence or whatever. Like, I believe you, and I believe that this happened to you, and I'm going to support you. And it's just so crucial, because they need that support, and they need that just confirmation, like, okay, I'm not crazy. Something did happen to me, and nobody can take that. Like, nobody can convince me otherwise. Like, this happened to me, and I need, something needs to happen about it. And it's a slow process. Like, as we saw in the 1950s, they were just trying to, you know, they were opening the door for trying to prove that husbands were still beating their wives, and they needed X amount of proof. And today we still need those things. And sometimes it's still hard to get an injunction, even with all the cell phone videos and text messages and all of these things. So it's important to, if you are a survivor and you are trying to potentially break out of this, you know, situation, or even learn, make sure you're documenting things, make sure you're making sure that you're safe and your children are safe. Like, have those safety plans in place. And if you don't know how to safety plan, or you don't know what resources are available to you, you can reach out to us, and we can provide you those resources in Clay County. And on this post, when we post the video and everything, I will attach our hotline number. But if, and unfortunately I didn't attach the hotline number to this presentation, but if you are listening to this or watching this after we posted it, our hotline number is 904-284-0061. And we have advocates ready 24 hours a day to help you through whatever, and provide you the resources that you need to potentially be safe. But now I'm going to move more into the events that we have coming up that are open to everybody. And our economic justice advocate puts on budget workshops and credit workshops once a month. And it's a really, really, like, she starts with like the basics of budgeting. So even if you don't know how to save $1, she can help you try to figure it out. And she also has programs where she can help you one-on-one as well if you need those. But her budget workshop is next Wednesday at, I think it's 7 p.m. And it was posted earlier today on our social media. Unfortunately, I don't know for sure what the time is right this second. It's either at 7 p.m. or 11 a.m. But I think the credit workshop is at 11 a.m. on Friday of next week. And those things will be posted on our social medias and our website. And also, the SAM is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is the month of April. We will have a ton of stuff scheduled, and a lot of events and things like that, and community partners, and just a lot of information on social media. So make sure you stay tuned to that. We will have a specialized page on our website about Sexual Assault Awareness Month. It's not live yet, but it will be live on the 1st. But that will have a calendar of all of our events for the month, and a lot of information that, you know, you could potentially take to people who, you know, that have suffered sexual assault, or, you know, if you have been a survivor of sexual assault, those things might help you. And we also have services as well. We have our sexual assault center. We have forensic exams. We have counseling. We have all those things as well. And then our big fundraiser for Sexual Assault Awareness Month is our wine gala. Tickets are $50 for individuals, or people can sponsor tables for $1,000, and that's a table of 8. But there will be wine, hors d'oeuvres, there will be a live auction, a silent auction, there will be a photo booth, a live band. It'll be a really fun event. And we would love to see you there. You can get the information from our Facebook event, or you can go to our website at quigleyhouse.org/wine-gala. And that has the information, and you can also register on there and go ahead and pay if you would like to attend. Or if you would just like to donate, maybe you can attend, maybe you can't pay $50. If you would like to donate towards our cause, you can always go to our website and donate there. And honestly, any amount helps. It could be $5, it could be $1. All the proceeds from that event are going towards helping survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And we appreciate even just sharing our posts about the wine gala, so that way we can get more people involved and spread awareness. But we want to thank you for joining us today. And if anybody has any questions or needs anything, they can always reach out to our hotline, or you can comment below the video or send us DMs on social media, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can about any questions that you might have. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that you have a wonderful evening. Bye.